Good morning and good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to Episode 9 of the Beware the Day podcast. My name is Ryan, and as I say every week, there are over 5 million podcasts in the podcast universe, more than 70 million listeners, and I'm so happy that you chose this podcast to listen to today. I know last week I mentioned we were going to talk about um, employment and the African American community, the history of employment discrimination. But I'm going to postpone that until next week. Since this is Women's History Month, I wanted to expand our segment, our Black History Spotlight segment, and we're going to do an in-depth discussion of the life of Fannie Lou Hamer. Before I get started, as always, I want to thank Black El Paso Voice for this platform. Please subscribe and follow Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Apple, iHeart, and Spotify. And if you would like to donate to this podcast, the links will appear on the screen. So please consider a donation to the podcast. It will help us out tremendously. And as always, I'm going to talk about generational wealth each and every week because I believe that one of our solutions to our issues is to earn and preserve and protect generational wealth. And I posted a link to a webinar that took place yesterday. And I'm going to encourage you to go to my business page, KRC Companies LLC. You'll find a link. It's a rebroadcast of yesterday's webinar. I posted 2 links on that page. So if you're interested in creating and preserving generational wealth, take a look at that. And if you have any questions or concerns, please reach out to me on that page. Okay, now that we've gotten our housekeeping out of the way, let's begin our discussion of the life of Fannie Lou Hamer. And that name may or may not be familiar to a lot of you. When you say the civil rights movement, certain individuals come to mind, like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young, and so on. But I like to talk about those individuals that are not as well known as those gentlemen. And we're going to talk about Fannie Lou Hamer in the spirit of Women's History Month. So let's begin. Now, Fannie Lou Hamer was an American voting and women's rights activist, community organizer, and a leader in the civil rights movement. She was the vice chair of the Freedom Democratic Party, which she represented at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. She also organized Mississippi's Freedom Summer along with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And she was a co-founder of the National Women's Political Caucus, which is an organization created to recruit, train, and support women of all races who wish to seek election to government office. And that organization is still functioning to this day. She was born as Fannie Lou Townsend on October 6, 1917 in Montgomery County, Mississippi. And she was the youngest of 20 children born to Luella and James Lee Townsend. In 1919, the Townsends moved to Louisville, Mississippi to work as sharecroppers on W.D. Marlowe's plantation. From age 6, Hamer picked cotton with her family. During the winters of 1924 through 1930, she attended the one-room school provided for the sharecroppers' children, open between picking seasons. Fannie Lou Hamer loved reading and excelled in spelling bees and reciting poetry. But at age 12, she had to leave school to help support her aging parents. By age 13, she would pick between 200 to 300 pounds of cotton every day. And let's begin our discussion of the life of Fannie Lou Hamer. I think when I left off, I just mentioned that she would struggle with polio while picking cotton for her family. She continued to develop her reading and interpretation skills in Bible study, at her church in later years, and she was admired for her ability to read scripture. And anytime, and in 1944, after the plantation owner discovered her literacy, she was selected at its time as its time and record keeper. So she was promoted to time and record keeper on the plantation. Now, the following year, she married Perry Hamer, a tractor driver on the Marlowe plantation, and they remained there for the next 18 years. Hamer and her husband wanted very much to start a family, but in 1961, a white doctor subjected Hamer to a hysterectomy without her consent while she was undergoing surgery to remove a uterine tumor. Forced sterilization was a common method of population control in Mississippi that targeted poor African American women. Members of the Black community called the procedure a Mississippi appendectomy. The Hamers later raised two girls they adopted, eventually adopting two more. One, Dorothy Jean, died at age 22 of internal hemorrhaging after she was denied admission to the local hospital because of her mother's activism. On August 31st, 1962, Hamer and 17 others attempted to vote but failed a literacy test, which meant that they were denied this right. On December 4th, just after returning to her hometown, she went to the courthouse in Indianola to take the test again, but failed and was turned away. Hamer told the registrar, quote, "You'll see me every 30 days till I pass." But when she attempted to vote that fall, she discovered her registration gave her no actual power to vote, as her county also required voters to have 2 poll tax receipts. Hamer began to become more involved in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee after these incidents. She attended many Southern Christian leadership conferences, where she sometimes taught classes and various Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee workshops. She traveled to gather signatures for petitions to attempt to be granted federal resources for impoverished Black families across the South. In early 1963, she became a SNCC field secretary for voter registration and welfare programs. Many of these first attempts to register more Black voters in Mississippi were met with the same problems Hamer had found in trying to register herself. After her attempt to vote, Hamer was fired by her boss, but her husband was required to stay on the land until the end of the harvest. Hamer moved between homes over the next several days for protection. On September 10th, 1962, while staying with her friend Mary Tucker, Hamer was shot at 15 times in a drive-by shooting by racists. No one was injured in the event. The next day, Hamer and her family evacuated to nearby Tallahatchie County for 3 months, fearing retaliation by the Ku Klux Klan for her attempt to vote. On June 9th, 1963, Hamer was returning from a voter registration workshop by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Charleston, South Carolina. Traveling by bus with co-activists, they stopped for a break in Winona, Mississippi. Some of the activists went inside a local cafe but were refused service by the waitress. Shortly after, a Mississippi State Highway patrolman took out his billy club and intimidated the activists into leaving. One activist decided to take down the officer's license plate number. While doing so, the patrolman and a police chief entered the cafe and arrested the party. Hamer was arrested, beaten, and released on June 12th. She needed more than a month to recuperate from the beatings and never fully recovered. Though the incident left profound physical and psychological effects, including a blood clot over her left eye and permanent damage in one of her kidneys, Hamer returned to Mississippi to organize voter registration drives, including the 1963 Freedom Ballot, a mock election, and the Freedom Summer Initiative the following year. In 1964, Hamer helped co-found the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in an effort to prevent the regional all-white Democratic Party's attempts to stifle African American voices and to ensure that there was a party for all people that did not stand for any form of exploitation and discrimination, especially towards minorities.
Following the founding of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, Hamer and other activists traveled to the 1964 Democratic National Convention to stand as the official delegation from the state of Mississippi. Hamer's televised testimony was interrupted because of a scheduled speech that President Lyndon Johnson gave to 30 governors in the White House East Room. But most major news networks broadcast her testimony later that evening to the nation, giving Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party much exposure. In 1964, Hamer unsuccessfully ran for a seat in the U.S. Senate. She continued to work on other projects, including a grassroots level Head Start program and Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign. With the help of Julius Lester and Mary Varela, she published her autobiography in 1967. James Eastland, senator from Mississippi, was among the groups of people who sought to keep African Americans disenfranchised and segregated from society. His influence on the overarching agricultural industry often suppressed minority groups to keep whites as the only power force in America. Hamer objected to this and consequently pioneered the Freedom Farm Cooperative in 1969, an attempt to redistribute economic power across groups and to solidify an economic standing among African Americans. She was able to convince the editor of the Harvard Crimson, James Fallows, to write an article that advocated for donations to the Freedom Farm Cooperative. Eventually, the Freedom Farm Cooperative had raised around $8,000, which allowed Hamer to purchase 40 acres of land previously owned by a Black farmer who could no longer afford to occupy the land. This land became the Freedom Farm. The farm had three main objectives. These were to establish an agricultural organization that could supplement the nutritional needs of America's most disenfranchised people, to provide acceptable housing development, and to create an entrepreneurial business incubator that would provide resources for new companies and retraining for those with limited education but manual labor experience. Over time, the FFC offered various other services such as financial counseling, a scholarship fund, and a housing agency. The FFC aided in securing 35 Federal Housing Administration subsidized houses for struggling Black families. Though through her success, Hamer managed to acquire a new home, which served as an inspiration to others to begin building themselves up. The the Freedom Farm Cooperative disbanded in 1975 due to lack of funding. In 1971, Hamer co-founded the National Women's Political Caucus. She emphasized the power women could hold by acting as a voting majority in the country, regardless of race or ethnicity. Hamer died of complications from hypertension and breast cancer on March 14, 1977, at the age of 59, and she was buried in her hometown of Ruleville, Mississippi. Hamer was awarded honorary degrees from Tougaloo College, Howard University, and Shaw University, and she is an honorary member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. The life and struggle and triumph of Fannie Lou Hamer. And just to recap, of course, last week we talked about the struggle for equality as it pertained to education. And next week, we will talk about the struggle for equality, part 3 of that discussion, where we'll do a deep dive into the challenges African Americans face in the area of employment. In closing, I want to thank, once again, Black El Paso Voice. Stay tuned to this platform and make sure you check out Suite 915 with Curtis and Fedora and Real Talk with Marcus McCoy. And always remember, Black History Month is from January 1st through December 31st. Thank you for your time and attention today, and we'll see you next time.